O. Objects Relations Theory. Théorie de relation d'objet. Freud defines the object as that in which and through which the drive attains its aim. In the years following Freud's death, the twin concepts of the object and the object relation attained a growing importance in psychoanalytic theory, and eventually a whole school of psychoanalytic theory came to be known as object relations theory. The main proponents of object relations theory were Ronald Fairbairn, D.W. Winnicott, and Michael Balint, all of whom were members of the middle group of the British Psychoanalytical Society. These analysts differed on many points, and hence object relations theory covers a wide range of theoretical points of view. However, despite its lack of precise definition, object relations theory can be contrasted with ego psychology, on account of its focus on objects rather than on the drives in themselves. This focus on objects means that object relations theory pays more attention to the intersubjective constitution of the psyche in contrast to the more atomistic approach of ego psychology. The distinction between these two approaches has been blurred by more recent analysts such as Otto Kernberg, who have attempted to integrate object relations theory within an ego psychology framework. Although Lacanian psychoanalysis has been compared with object relations theory in that both schools of thought place more emphasis on intersubjectivity, Lacan himself criticizes object relations theory repeatedly. His criticisms focus most on the way in which object relations theory envisions the possibility of a complete and perfectly satisfying relation between the subject and the object. Lacan is opposed to such a view, arguing that for human beings there is no such thing as a pre-established harmony between a need and an object that satisfies it. The root of the error is, argues Lacan, that in object relations theory, the object is first and foremost an object of satisfaction. In other words, by locating the object in the register of satisfaction and need, object relations theory confuses the object of psychoanalysis with the object of biology and neglects the symbolic dimension of desire. One dire consequence that follows from this is that the specific difficulties which arise from the symbolic constitution of desire are neglected, with the result that mature object relations and ideals of genital love are proposed as the goal of treatment. Thus, object relations theory becomes the site of a delirious moralism. See also genital. A closely related aspect of object relations theory which Lacan also criticizes is its shift of emphasis from the Oedipal triangle onto the mother-child relation, with the latter conceived of as a perfectly symmetrical reciprocal relation. One of Lacan's fundamental concerns is to restore the centrality of the Oedipal triangle to psychoanalysis by re-emphasizing the importance of the father in contrast to the object relations emphasis on the mother. This concern can be seen in Lacan's criticism of the object relation as a symmetrical dual relation, and his view that the object relation is an intersubjective relation which involves not two but three terms. Lacan's criticism of British object relations theory, as summarized above, is one of the main themes of the first year of his public seminar. 1953-1954. In the fourth year of the seminar entitled Object Relations, Lacan discusses not the British school of object relations theory, Balint, Fairbairn, Guntrip, etc., but the French school of object relations theory, Maurice Bouvet. Objet petit a. This term has sometimes been translated into English as objet little a, but Lacan insisted that it should remain untranslated, thus acquiring as it were the status of an algebraic sign. Sheridan, see algebra. The symbol a, the first letter of the word autre or other, is one of the first algebraic signs which appears in Lacan's work and is first introduced in 1955 in connection with schema L. It is always lowercase and italicized to show that it denotes the little other in opposition to the capital A of the big other. Unlike the big other, which represents a radical and irreducible alterity, the little other is the other which isn't an other at all, since it is essentially coupled with the ego in a relationship which is always reflexive, interchangeable. In schema L, then objectivity A and objectivity A accent designate indiscriminately the ego and the counterpart specular image and clearly belong to the imaginary order. So in this sense, in schema L, then little a and little a accent designate indiscriminately the ego and the counterpart under the bar specular image and slash specular image and clearly belong to the imaginary order. In 1957, when Lacan introduces the theme of fantasy, between brackets as Barth in congruence with objectivity A begins to be conceived as the object of desire. This is the imaginary part object, an element which is imagined as separable from the rest of the body. Lacan now begins to distinguish between objectivity A, the object of desire, and the specular image, which he now symbolizes little I between brackets objectivity A. In the seminar of 1960-1961, Lacan articulates the objectivity A with the term agalma, a Greek term meaning a glory, an ornament, an offering to the gods, or a little statue of a god, which he extracts from Plato's Symposium, just as the agalma is a precious object hidden inside a relatively worthless box, so the objectivity A is the object of desire which we seek in the other. From 1963 onwards, objectivity A comes increasingly to acquire connotations of the real, although it never loses its imaginary status. In 1973, Lacan can still say that it is imaginary. From this point on, objectivity A denotes the object which can never be attained, which is clearly the cause of desire, rather than that towards which desire tends. This is why Lacan now calls it the object cause of desire. Objectivity A is any object which sets desire in motion, especially the partial objects which define the drives. The drives do not seek to attain the objectivity A, but rather circle around it. Objectivity A is both the object of anxiety and the final irreducible reserve of libido. It plays an increasingly important part in Lacan's concept of the treatment, in which the analyst must situate himself as the semblance of objectivity A, the cause of the analysant's desire. In the seminars of 1962-1963 and of 1964, objectivity A is defined as the leftover, the remainder, French, reste, the remnant left behind by the introduction of the symbolic in the real. This is developed further in the seminar of 1969-1970, in which Lacan elaborates his formulae of the four discourses. In the discourse of the master, one signifier attempts to represent the subject for all other signifiers, but inevitably a surplus is always produced. This surplus is objectivity A, a surplus meaning and a surplus enjoyment, French plus jouir. This concept is inspired by Marx's concept of surplus value. Objectivity A is the excess of jouissance which has no use value, but persists for the mere sake of enjoyment. In 1973, Lacan links objectivity A to the concept of semblance, asserting that objectivity A is a semblance of being. In 1974, he places it at the center of the Borromean, not at the place where the three orders, real, symbolic, and imaginary, all intersect. Obsessional neurosis. Nevrosis obsessionnelle. Obsessional neurosis was first isolated as a specific diagnostic category by Freud in 1894. In doing so, Freud grouped together as one condition a series of symptoms which had been described long before but which had been linked with a variety of different diagnostic categories, Laplanche and Pontali. These symptoms include obsessions, recurrent ideas, impulses to perform actions which seem absurd and or abhorrent to the subject, and rituals, compulsively repeated actions such as checking or washing. While Lacan also sees these symptoms as typical of obsessional neurosis, he argues that obsessional neurosis designates not a set of symptoms but an underlying structure which may or may not manifest itself in the symptoms typically associated with it. Thus, the subject may well exhibit none of the typical obsessional symptoms and yet still be diagnosed as an obsessional neurotic by a Lacanian analyst. Following Freud, Lacan classes obsessional neurosis as one of the main forms of neurosis. In 1956, Lacan develops the idea that, like hysteria, of which Freud said it is a dialect, obsessional neurosis is essentially a question which being poses for the subject. The question which constitutes obsessional neurosis concerns the contingency of one's existence, the question about death, which may be phrased to be or not to be. Am I dead or alive? Or why do I exist? The response of the obsessional is to work feverishly to justify his existence, which also testifies to the special burden of guilt felt by the obsessional. The obsessional performs some compulsive ritual because he thinks that this will enable him to escape the lack in the big other, the castration of the big other, which is often represented in fantasy as some terrible disaster. For example, in the case of one of Freud's obsessional neurotic patients, whom Freud nicknamed the Rat Man, the patient had developed elaborate rituals which he performed to ward off the fear of a terrible punishment being inflicted on his father or on his beloved. These rituals, both in their form and content, led Freud to draw parallels between the structure of obsessional neurosis and the structure of religion, parallels which Lacan also notes. Whereas the hysterical question concerns the subject's sexual position, am I a man or a woman? The obsessional neurotic repudiates this question, refusing both sexes, calling himself neither male nor female. The obsessional is precisely neither one sex nor the other. One may also say that he is both at once. Lacan also draws attention to the way that the obsessional neurotic's question about existence and death has consequences for his attitude to time. This attitude can be one of perpetual hesitation and procrastination while waiting for death, or of considering oneself immortal because one is already dead. Other features of obsessional neurosis which Lacan comments on are the sense of guilt and the close connection with anal erotism. In respect to the latter, Lacan remarks that the obsessional neurotic does not only transform his shit into gifts and his gifts into shit, but also transforms himself into shit. Oedipus's complex, complex d'Oedipe. The Oedipus complex was defined by Freud as an unconscious set of loving and hostile desires which the subject experiences in relation to its parents. The subject desires one parent and thus enters into rivalry with the other parent. In the positive form of the Oedipus complex, the desired parent is the parent of the opposite sex to the subject, and the parent of the same sex is the rival. The Oedipus complex emerges in the 3rd year of life and then declines in the 5th year, when the child renounces sexual desire for its parents and identifies with the rival. Freud argued that all psychopathological structures could be traced to a malfunction in the Oedipus complex, which has thus dubbed the nuclear complex of the neurosis. Although the term does not appear in Freud's writings until 1910, traces of its origins can be found much earlier in his work, and by 1910 it was already showing signs of the central importance that it was to acquire in all psychoanalytic theory thereafter. Lacan first addresses the Oedipus complex in his 1938 article on the family, where he argues that it is the last and most important of the 3 family complexes. See complex. At this point, his account of the Oedipus complex does not differ from Freud's, his only originality being to emphasize its historical and cultural relativity, taking his cue from the anthropological studies by Malinowski and others. Lacan. It is in the 1950s that Lacan begins to develop his own distinctive conception of the Oedipus complex, though he always follows Freud in regarding the Oedipus complex as the central complex in the unconscious. He now begins to differ from from Freud on a number of important points. The most important of these is that in Lacan's view the subject always desires the mother, and the father is always the rival, irrespective of whether the subject is male or female. Consequently, in Lacan's account, the male subject experiences the Oedipus complex in a radically asymmetrical way to the female subject. See sexual difference. The Oedipus complex is, for Lacan, the paradigmatic triangular structure which contrasts with all dual relations, though see the final paragraph below. The key function in the Oedipus complex is thus that of the father, the third term which transforms the dual relation between mother and child into a triadic structure. The Oedipus complex is thus nothing less than the passage from the imaginary order to the symbolic order, the conquest of the symbolic relation as such. The fact that a passage to the symbolic passes via a complex sexual dialectic means that the subject cannot have access to the symbolic order without confronting the problem of sexual difference. In the seminar Book 5, Lacan analyzes this passage from the imaginary to the symbolic by identifying 3 times of the Oedipus complex, the sequence being one of logical rather than chronological priority. The first time of the Oedipus complex is characterized by the imaginary triangle of mother, child, and phallus. In the previous seminar of 1956-57, Lacan calls this the pre-Oedipal triangle, see pre-Oedipal phase. However, whether this triangle is regarded as pre-Oedipal or as a moment in the Oedipus complex itself, the main point is the same, namely that prior to the invention of the father there is never a purely dual relation between the mother and the child, but always a third term, the phallus, an imaginary object which the mother desires beyond the child himself. Lacan hints that the presence of the imaginary phallus as a third term in the imaginary triangle indicates that the symbolic father is already functioning at this time. In the first time of the Oedipus complex, then the child realizes that both he and the mother are marked by a lack. The mother is marked by a lack since she is seen to be incomplete, otherwise she would not desire. The subject is also marked by a lack since he does not completely satisfy the mother's desire. The lacking element in both cases is the imaginary phallus. The mother desires the phallus she lacks, and in conformity with Hegel's theory of desire, the subject seeks to become the object of her desire. He seeks to be the phallus for the mother and fill out her lack. At this point the mother is omnipotent and her desire is the law, although this omnipotence may be seen as threatening from the very beginning. The sense of threat is intensified when the child's own sexual drives begin to manifest themselves, for example in infantile masturbation. This emergence of the real of the drive introduces a discordant note of anxiety into the previously seductive imaginary triangle. The child is now confronted with the realization that he cannot simply fool the mother's desire with the imaginary semblance of a phallus. He must present something in the real. Yet the child's real organ, whether boy or girl, is hopelessly inadequate. This sense of inadequacy and impotence in the face of an omnipotent maternal desire that cannot be placated gives rise to anxiety. Only the intervention of the father in the subsequent times of the Oedipus complex can provide a real solution to this anxiety. The second time of the Oedipus complex is characterized by the intervention of the imaginary father. The father imposes the law on the mother's desire by denying her access to the phallic object and forbidding the subject access to the mother. Lacan often refers to this intervention as the castration of the mother, even though he states that, properly speaking, the operation is not one of castration but of privation. This intervention is mediated by the discourse of the mother. In other words, what is important is not that the real father step in and impose the law, but that this law be respected by the mother herself in both her words and her actions. The subject now sees the father as a rival for the mother's desire. The third time of the Oedipus complex is marked by the intervention of the real father by showing that he has the phallus and neither exchanges it nor gives it. The real father castrates the child in the sense of making it impossible for the child to persist in trying to be the phallus for the mother. It is no use competing with the real father because he always wins. The subject is freed from the impossible and anxiety-provoking task of having to be the phallus by realizing that the father has it. This allows the subject to identify with the father. In this secondary symbolic identification, the subject transcends the aggressivity inherent in primary imaginary identification. Lacan follows Freud in arguing that the superego is formed out of this Oedipal identification with the father. Since the symbolic is the realm of the law, and since the Oedipus complex is the conquest of the symbolic order, it has a normative and normalizing function. The Oedipus complex is essential for the human being to be able to accede to a humanized structure of the real. This normative function is to be understood in reference to both clinical structures and the question of sexuality. The Oedipus complex and clinical structures. In accordance with Freud's view of the Oedipus complex as the root of all psychopathology, Lacan relates all the clinical structures to difficulties in this complex. Since it is impossible to resolve the complex completely, a completely non-pathological position does not exist. The closest thing is a neurotic structure. The neurotic has come through all 3 times of the Oedipus complex, and there is no such thing as a neurosis without Oedipus. On the other hand, psychosis, perversion, and phobia result when something is essentially incomplete in the Oedipus complex. In psychosis, there is a fundamental blockage even before the first time of the Oedipus complex. In perversion, the complex is carried through to the 3rd time, but instead of identifying with the father, the subject identifies with the mother and or the imaginary phallus, thus harking back to the imaginary pre-Oedipal triangle. A phobia arises when the subject cannot make the transition from the 2nd time of the Oedipus complex to the 3rd time because the real father does not intervene. The phobia then functions as a substitute for the intervention of the real father, thus permitting the subject to make the passage to the 3rd time of the Oedipus complex, though often in an atypical way. The Oedipus complex and sexuality. It is the particular way the subject navigates his passage through the Oedipus complex that determines both his assumption of a sexual position and his choice of a sexual object on the question of object choice. In his seminar of 1969-1970, Lacan re-examines the Oedipus complex and analyzes the myth of Oedipus as one of Freud's dreams. In this seminar, though not for the first time, see seminar 7, Lacan compares the myth of Oedipus with the other Freudian myths, the myth of the father of the horde in Totem and Taboo and the myth of the murder of Moses, and argues that the myth of Totem and Taboo is structurally opposite to the myth of Oedipus. In the myth of Oedipus, the murder of the father allows Oedipus to enjoy sexual relations with his mother, whereas in the myth of Totem and Taboo, the murder of the father, far from allowing access to the father's women, only reinforces the law which forbids incest. Lacan argues that in this respect the myth of Totem and Taboo is more accurate than the myth of Oedipus. The former shows that enjoyment of the mother is impossible, whereas the latter presents enjoyment of the mother as forbidden, but not impossible. In the Oedipus complex, a prohibition of jouissance thus serves to hide the impossibility of this jouissance. The subject can thus persist in the neurotic illusion that, were it not for the law which forbids it, jouissance would be possible. In his reference to fourfold models, Lacan makes an implicit criticism of all triangular models of the Oedipus complex. Thus, though the Oedipus complex can be seen as a transition from a dual relationship through a triangular structure, Lacan argues that it is more accurately represented as the transition from a pre-Oedipal triangle mother-child phallus to an Oedipal quaternary mother-child-father phallus. Another possibility is to see the Oedipus complex as a transition from the pre-Oedipal triangle mother-child phallus to the Oedipal triangle mother-child-father. Optical model, modèle optique. Freud compares the psyche with an optical apparatus such as a microscope or a camera in the interpretation of dreams. Lacan also uses optical apparatuses at several points in his work. For example, he uses the camera to provide a materialist definition of the phenomenon of consciousness. Lacan argues that optics is a useful way of approaching the structure of the psyche because images play an important role in psychic structure. However, like Freud, Lacan warns that such an approach can never provide more than rather crude analogies, since optical images are not the same as the kind of images which are the object of psychoanalytic research. For this reason, Lacan soon replaces optical images with topological figures which are intended to prevent imaginary capture. See topology. Nevertheless, as Freud said of his own optical models, we need the assistance of provisional ideas. The optical model first appears in 1954, which is the version reproduced in figure 12 taken from seminar 124 and is taken up later in A Remark on Daniel Lagache's report. In the seminar on the transference and elsewhere, it is basically an optical experiment which is constructed by means of a plane mirror and a concave mirror. The concave mirror produces a real image of an inverted flower pot hidden from view by a box, which is then reflected in the plane mirror to produce a virtual image. This virtual image is only visible to a subject who places himself within a particular area of vision. Lacan uses the model to illustrate various points. Two of the most important points are the structuring role of the symbolic order and the function of the ego ideal. 1. The optical model illustrates the way that the position of the subject in the symbolic order, represented by the angle of the plane mirror, determines the way in which the imaginary is articulated with the real. My position in the imaginary is only conceivable insofar as one finds a guide beyond the imaginary on the level of the symbolic plane. The optical model thus illustrates the primary importance of the symbolic order in structuring the imaginary. The action of psychoanalytic treatment can be compared to the rotation of the plane mirror, which alters the position of the subject in the symbolic. 2. The optical model also illustrates the function of the ideal ego, which is represented in the diagram as the real image, in opposition to the ego ideal, which is the symbolic guide governing the angle of the mirror and hence the position of the subject. Order. Ordre. Lacan uses the terms real, symbolic, and imaginary from early on in his work. It is not until 1953 that he speaks of these as three orders or three registers. From that moment on, they come to be the fundamental classification system around which all his theorizing turns. The imaginary, the symbolic, and the real thus comprise a basic classification system which allows important distinctions to be drawn between concepts which, according to Lacan, had previously been confused in psychoanalytic theory. For example, Lacan argues that much misunderstanding has arisen in psychoanalytic theory due to a failure to distinguish between the imaginary father, the symbolic father, and the real father. Thus, Lacan claims that his tripartite classification system has shed invaluable light on Freud's work. Without these three systems to guide ourselves by, it would be impossible to understand anything of the Freudian technique and experience. The imaginary, the symbolic, and the real are profoundly heterogeneous, each referring to quite distinct aspects of psychoanalytic experience. It is therefore difficult to see what they have in common, and yet the fact that Lacan refers to all three as orders implies that they share some common property. Lacan explores this question of what the three orders have in common by means of the topology of the Borromean knot in his 1974-75 seminar. They are not mental forces like the three agencies in Freud's structural model. However, they are primarily concerned with mental functioning, and together they cover the whole field of psychoanalysis. Although the three orders are profoundly heterogeneous, each order must be defined by reference to the other two. The structural interdependence of the three orders is illustrated by the Borromean knot, in which the severing of any of one of the three rings causes the other two to become separated also. Small other, big other. Autre, autre. The other is perhaps the most complex term in Lacan's work. When Lacan first begins to use the term in the 1930s, it is not very salient, and refers simply to other people. Although Freud does use the term other, speaking of both der andere, the other person, and das andere, otherness, Lacan seems to have borrowed the term from Hegel, to whose work Lacan was introduced in a series of lectures given by Alexandre Kojève at the École des Hautes Études in 1933-39. See Kojève. In 1955, Lacan draws a distinction between the little other, the other, and the big other, the big other. A distinction which remains central throughout the rest of his work. Thereafter, in Lacanian algebra, the big other is designated capital A, uppercase for French autre, and the little other is designated small a, lowercase italicized for French autre. Lacan asserts that an awareness of this distinction is fundamental to analytic practice. The analyst must be thoroughly imbued with the difference between capital A and small a, so that he can situate himself in the place of big other and not of the other. 1. The little other is the other who is not really other, but a reflection and projection of the ego, which is why the symbol small a can represent the little other and the ego interchangeably in schema L. He is simultaneously the counterpart and the specular image. The little other is thus entirely inscribed in the imaginary order. For a more detailed discussion of the development of the symbol small a in Lacan's work, see Objet petit a. 2. The big other designates a radical alterity, an otherness which transcends the illusory otherness of the imaginary because it cannot be assimilated through identification. Lacan equates this radical alterity with language and the law, and hence the big other is inscribed in the order of the symbolic. Indeed, the big other is the symbolic insofar as it is particularized for each subject. The big other is thus both another subject in his radical alterity and unassimilable uniqueness, and also the symbolic order which mediates the relationship with that other subject. However, the meaning of the big other as another subject is strictly secondary to the meaning of the big other as symbolic order. The big other must first of all be considered a locus, the locus in which speech is constituted. It is thus only possible to speak of the big other as a subject in a secondary case, in a secondary sense, in the sense that a subject may occupy this position and thereby embody the big other for another subject. In arguing that speech originates not in the ego nor even in the subject, but in the big other, Lacan is stressing that speech and language are beyond one's conscious control. They come from another place outside consciousness, and hence the unconscious is the discourse of the big other. In conceiving of the big other as a place, Lacan alludes to Freud's concept of psychical locality, in which the unconscious is described as the other scene. See scene. It is the mother who first occupies the position of the big other for the child, because it is she who receives the child's primitive cries and retroactively sanctions them as a particular message. See punctuation. The castration complex is formed when the child discovers that this big other is not complete, that there is a lack in the big other. In other words, there is always a signifier missing from the treasury of signifiers constituted by the big other. The mythical complete big other, written capital A in Lacanian algebra, does not exist. In 1957, Lacan illustrates this incomplete big other graphically by striking a bar through the symbol A to produce a barred. Hence, another name for the castrated incomplete big other is the barred big other. The big other is also the other sex, or the big other sex. The big other sex is always woman for both male and female subjects. Man here acts as the relay whereby the woman becomes this big other for herself as she is this big other for him.